My husband looked me in the eye and said, "You're not pretty enough to come with me tonight." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded and stayed home. That sentence echoed in my head long after the front door slammed. I stood in front of the hallway mirror for a full minute, not moving, just looking at myself. My makeup was still fresh. The soft mauve lipstick I chose matched my dress, not flashy but elegant. My pearl earrings caught the dim light of the hallway lamp. I thought I looked nice, not stunning perhaps, but refined, presentable. His word, "not pretty enough," sliced through everything, my effort, my dignity, my years of support. I had been married to Martin for 35 years. We'd built a life together, a house full of books and laughter and children, then one that gradually quieted into routine. I believed, maybe foolishly, that we were still a team, that after all these years, we'd at least earned each other's respect. But standing there in my heels, one strap already slipping off my shoulder, I realized something had shifted. Not suddenly, but quietly, like dust settling until it covers everything. Martin hadn't always been cruel. He wasn't the yelling type. He rarely raised his voice, never threw anything, never stormed out in a fit. But over time, his compliments faded. His eyes stopped lingering. The small gestures, a hand on my lower back, a passing kiss on the cheek, vanished without either of us marking the moment they stopped. I thought it was just the years, the routines, the kids. I thought I was being practical, understanding. I never expected disdain. As I stepped out of my shoes and picked up my clutch, still unopened, I caught my reflection again. I remembered being 28 and meeting Martin at a conference. He said I had fire in my eyes, and he liked that I was the smartest woman in the room. I remember the way he looked at me back then, like he'd won something. Now, he looked at me like I was something he had to apologize for. I walked to the kitchen and turned off the slow cooker. The roast I'd made would go cold now. It was supposed to be our post-event dinner, something warm to come home to. I slid it into the fridge and wrapped the sides carefully. Every motion, covering the mashed potatoes, rinsing the wine glasses, folding the napkins, felt mechanical, like I was watching myself go through the motions of a night that never happened. At 8:12 p.m., I got a text from my daughter, Julia. "How did the event go? Did Dad introduce you to the new boss?" I stared at the message. I didn't know how to answer, not because I didn't have words, but because the truth felt too small, too personal, too humiliating to type out. I didn't want to become a story Julia pitied, so I replied, "He went alone. I wasn't feeling up to it." That was the first lie I told to protect him, or maybe to protect myself. I wasn't sure yet. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, dress still on, makeup still flawless, earrings still swinging slightly with every breath. I looked at the empty chair across from me, Martin's chair, and wondered when it became just furniture. When had we become something he could be embarrassed by? I didn't cry that night. Not then. Not when he came home hours later smelling like scotch and expensive cologne, tossing his keys onto the counter with a careless flick. He didn't say anything about the event, didn't mention the speech he gave, the people he met, or the food. He didn't say I was missed. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, still sitting at the table in the dark, and asked, "Why are you still awake?" I looked at him for a long time and replied, "No reason." But in that silence, something shifted in me. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, that quiet, brutal moment, would be the beginning of everything. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before all of this, before the silence, the cold comments, and the quiet humiliation, there was something else. There was warmth, there was laughter, and there was love. Or at least something I believed was love. It's easy to look back and question everything, to doubt your own memories, but I try to hold on to what I know was real, because it mattered. I mattered. And in those early years, I think Martin believed that too. I met Martin when I was 27. I had just started teaching literature at a high school in Raleigh, and he was working as a junior sales manager for a mid-sized tech firm. He came in to give a presentation on some new learning software the school board was considering. He was charming, the kind of man who seemed to remember everyone's name and say it just right. When he found out I taught English, he asked about my favorite book. When I said Jane Eyre, he said, "So you like women who know their worth?" That line made me smile then. Now it feels like something from a different life. Our courtship was quick. Martin liked to say he didn't need time to make up his mind. We got married after 11 months. Our wedding wasn't extravagant, but it was joyful. We danced under fairy lights in my mother's backyard, drank too much cheap champagne, and laughed until midnight. He used to touch the small of my back whenever we were near people, like he was proud to be near me. I remember those touches. They used to mean something. We built a life together in a modest house with peeling paint and a garden that never quite stayed weed-free. But we were happy. At least I thought we were. I cooked. He worked. I graded papers late at night while he drafted reports. He'd read parts of my students' essays aloud just to laugh at the funny parts. I thought we were a team. We were raising 2 children, Julia, now 34, and Emmett, 31. They were the center of our world, or mine at least. Back then, Martin would take me to every work dinner, every event. I was his +1, his confidant. He'd squeeze my hand under the table, whisper jokes in my ear. We'd come home late and recap the evening while brushing our teeth. He'd say things like, "You handled that conversation better than I ever could," or, "I'm lucky you're smarter than me." It felt like partnership, mutual admiration, respect. I think about those moments now, and I wonder if they were sincere, or if they were just things he thought he was supposed to say at the time. Did he grow tired of pretending? Or did I simply stop being someone he admired? When I turned 50, we hosted a dinner party for his colleagues. I made lemon rosemary chicken and set the table with our wedding china. I wore a blue wrap dress Martin had picked out for me on my birthday. He told me I looked radiant. I remember how he kept his hand on my waist as we moved through the room. That night, I felt seen, valued, wanted. It didn't last. Slowly, subtly, things changed. The compliments became less frequent. The invitations stopped coming. When I asked why he didn't want me to come to a particular event, he'd say, "You wouldn't enjoy it," or, "It's just a work thing, nothing special." But it was special. It was a piece of his life he no longer wanted me in. And at first, I didn't fight it. I told myself it was fine, that I was tired anyway. I had a book to finish, papers to grade, groceries to buy. I made excuses for him and for myself. Looking back, I can see how I made it easy for him. I didn't question the shift. I didn't protest when he started coming home later. I thought if I gave him space, if I didn't cling or complain, he'd come back around. That's what they say, right? Love means giving someone room to breathe. But sometimes, love means noticing when someone is slowly closing the door on you and calling it out before it slams shut. I still held on to the belief that we were in this together, that maybe this was just a season, a phase. I didn't see it for what it really was, the beginning of the end of our partnership and the beginning of me learning to live in the shadow of a man who had forgotten what made me beautiful in the first place. But I remembered. Not all at once, and not clearly, but I did remember. And that's where everything started to shift. It wasn't a dramatic moment, not some huge argument or cruel insult shouted across a room. No, the first red flag was quiet, small, forgettable maybe if I'd let it be, but it lodged in my chest, and no matter how I tried to ignore it, it stayed there, a single moment that hinted at a deeper truth I wasn't ready to face. It was a networking dinner, one of the last I ever attended with Martin. His company had just landed a major client, and the event was being held at a sleek rooftop venue downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting, sharp suits, and the soft clink of expensive glasses. I spent the afternoon getting ready. I wore a deep green dress, the one Martin used to say made my eyes stand out. I curled my hair. I even stopped by the department store to buy a new lipstick. I wanted to look elegant, confident. I wanted him to be proud to have me there. When we arrived, he slipped into his professional mode almost instantly. Confident, charming, laughing easily with the junior staff, shaking hands with senior executives. I stayed close at first, offering polite smiles, letting him lead the way through conversations. Then came the moment that never left me. We were standing with a group of 4, a couple of newer hires and Greta Monroe, the vice president at the time. She was a force of nature, tall and poised, with a voice that made people stop talking and listen. Someone asked Martin how long we'd been married, and he laughed, this light, dismissive laugh, and said, "Too long to count." Everyone chuckled awkwardly. Then Greta, trying to recover the tone, said, "And what do you do, Corinne?" Before I could answer, Martin cut in, saying, "Oh, she teaches part-time now, mostly volunteers. Keeps herself busy." And just like that, he turned to someone else, shifting the conversation toward business projections for the next quarter. I stood there, frozen for a second. My mouth was slightly open, not enough to speak, just enough to let in the air I suddenly needed. I'd been teaching for over 3 decades. I had chaired departments. I'd mentored young teachers, helped build programs, and even contributed to curriculum development. But in that moment, I wasn't a teacher. I wasn't his equal. I was just someone who kept herself busy. Greta looked at me for a beat longer than necessary. There was a flicker of something in her expression. Pity, maybe, or recognition. She said, "Well, that's often the most important work," before being swept into another conversation. I appreciated her effort, but the damage had already been done. I tried to shake it off. I smiled and nodded my way through the evening. I even complimented someone on their shoes just to feel like I was part of something. But inside, I was unraveling. When we got home, I didn't say anything. I wanted to. I almost did. I stood in the bathroom wiping off my makeup, watching my reflection, rehearsing the words in my head. Why did you say that? Why did you make me feel small? But I said nothing. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He made coffee, left a quick peck on my cheek, and walked out the door with his briefcase and confidence fully intact. I sat at the kitchen table with a growing ache in my chest. That was the moment I knew something had changed, not just in him, but in me. I stopped being seen, not just by the world, but by the person I trusted most to see me. And worse, I had started believing I didn't need to be seen, that it was okay to shrink, to stay quiet, to let him edit me out of the story he told about our life. But it wasn't okay. And that night, that moment of being talked over, minimized, erased, was the first time I felt the crack beneath the surface. It would take many more cracks to break the foundation, but that was the first one. And even though I buried it deep, I never forgot it. Because that was the night I realized I was slowly becoming invisible in my own marriage. After that night on the rooftop, something shifted in me. I didn't say anything to Martin, not then. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, that he probably didn't mean anything by it. But the ache lingered, not just in my chest, but in the quiet moments that followed. It's strange how the absence of something, attention, care, affection, can be louder than any scream. That's how it started, not with anger or betrayal, but with slow, steady erasure. In the weeks that followed, Martin became more distant. Not physically, he was still there, still sitting on the couch every evening, still drinking his coffee in the same spot at the kitchen table. But the warmth that used to live in his eyes when he looked at me was gone. The small gestures, the ones you never think to name until they disappear, faded. He stopped asking how my day was. He stopped pausing to hear the answer if I told him anyway. I remember one morning, I stood in the kitchen holding 2 neckties, one navy with thin silver stripes, the other a solid deep red. I asked, "Which one should you wear today?" He didn't even look up from his phone, just mumbled, "Does it matter?" and walked off to his office. I stared at the ties in my hands for a full minute before putting them both away. It wasn't about the ties. It never is. He used to come home and greet me with a kiss, a comment, a joke about his day. Now he walked in talking on the phone and stayed that way until dinner. If I tried to engage, he'd raise a finger. Not to hush me rudely, but as if I were a secretary interrupting something urgent. It was subtle, professional, and devastating. I remember folding laundry one Sunday when he walked into the room. I had just washed and ironed his shirts, arranged everything by color like I always did. I looked up and smiled, expecting him to notice. He didn't. He just picked up the remote and turned on the news. I sat there holding a pair of his socks and felt the sharp sting of invisibility. Our conversations became logistical. What time is the plumber coming? Did you schedule the dentist for Emmett? We're out of olive oil. Gone were the warm, meandering talks about books, films, or even neighborhood gossip. And when I tried to bring those moments back, mentioning a novel I read or how Julia's son had drawn me as a superhero, he nodded politely, but I could see his mind was somewhere else, usually in his phone. I started feeling like a guest in my own home. The house was the same, but the air felt colder. I'd wake up early to cook his favorite oatmeal with cinnamon and walnuts, and he'd grab a protein bar on the way out instead. I stopped putting cinnamon in. I stopped making oatmeal. I started eating alone. At night, we sat on the same couch but miles apart. He watched sports or scrolled through his phone. I knitted or read. Sometimes, I tried to comment on something just to feel a spark. That quarterback looks like your cousin Don. He'd nod, barely listening. I once asked, "Do you ever miss when we used to talk for hours?" He looked at me confused. We still talk, don't we? And in that moment, I realized how deeply unaware he was of the distance between us. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't angry. That might have been easier to deal with. At least then I could fight. But what do you do when someone stops seeing you? When you become part of the furniture? Something useful, familiar, but background. Worse, I began to internalize it. I questioned my looks, my age, my worth. I started skipping makeup altogether. I wore plain clothes, not because I didn't care, but because it seemed no one else did either. I stopped speaking up at family dinners, stopped offering advice, stopped laughing loudly. It felt like every part of me that used to take up space was being gently pushed aside. That's what emotional erosion looks like. Not a tidal wave, but a slow leak that hollows you out piece by piece until you're just a shell sitting at the edge of your own life. And at the time, I didn't realize how dangerous that silence inside me had become. I only knew I was shrinking, and he wasn't even noticing. There's a special kind of pain that comes from humiliation. Not the kind that erupts during an argument, loud and dramatic. I'm talking about the quiet kind. The kind that catches you off guard, that no one else sees as cruel. Except you. The kind that rewrites how you see yourself in just a few seconds. It happened one Saturday evening, about 2 years after that rooftop dinner. Martin had just received a regional sales award. His company was hosting a formal banquet to celebrate. The event was at the downtown Marriott. Black tie, catered dinner, speeches. He hadn't invited me. When I asked why, he gave me a rehearsed answer. It's mostly for internal teams. Just boring work stuff. You wouldn't be interested. I nodded, pretending it didn't sting. But Julia, our daughter, heard about the banquet through a mutual friend and called me, surprised. "Aren't you going with Dad? It's a pretty big night for him." I lied. I said I had a cold. I said I encouraged him to go alone, but inside I was aching. I remembered attending similar events in the past, when he used to beam at me across the room and brag about how I edited his speeches. I missed being part of his world. I missed being introduced as someone who mattered. That night, I decided, maybe foolishly, to show up. I didn't plan to crash the banquet or make a scene. I just wanted to see it, to see him. I dressed carefully, in a black silk blouse and a charcoal skirt I hadn't worn in years. I curled my hair, applied my makeup with trembling fingers. I wasn't there to confront him. I just needed to remember what it felt like to be in a room where people knew my name. I arrived at the hotel early, standing in the hallway near the ballroom. I didn't go in. I stood by a tall vase of artificial orchids, holding a clutch I didn't need, pretending to check my phone. I saw him before he saw me. He was standing near the entrance, laughing with 2 younger men in suits. He looked good, confident, polished, Then his boss, Greta Monroe, approached. I heard her say, "Is Corinne coming? I was hoping to finally meet her again. It's been ages." Martin gave a tight smile and replied, "Oh, she's not really comfortable with these events anymore. You know how women get." His voice had that light, dismissive tone, the same one he used when explaining away minor inconveniences. Greta's face tightened. She nodded slowly, then turned to speak with someone else. My throat went dry. You know how women get. I felt the blood rush to my ears. That wasn't just a lie. It was an insult, a minimization. I wasn't home with the flu. I hadn't withdrawn from these events. I'd been pushed out, and now he was framing it like I was the problem. Like I had faded and he had risen. Like I was too fragile, too fussy, too much of an embarrassment to be there. I turned to leave. My hands were shaking as I stepped outside into the cool air. I walked to the parking garage and sat in the car with my head resting on the steering wheel. I didn't cry, not at first. I was too stunned. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the lie or how easily he told it, how comfortable he was rewriting the truth in front of people who once respected me. When the tears finally came, they were slow and quiet. I felt humiliated, not because the world had mocked me, but because the man I'd supported for decades had erased me, and done it with a smile. When I got home, I went straight to the bathroom and removed my makeup. I stared at my face in the mirror. Same face I'd had when he called me radiant years ago. Same eyes, same smile, only dimmer now. Not from age, but from exhaustion. I whispered to myself, "You are not invisible," though it felt like a lie. That night, something cracked, not loudly, not like a slammed door or shattered glass, but something inside me shifted. A fracture in the foundation of how I saw him, and maybe, for the first time, how I saw myself. After the banquet incident, something hardened inside me. I didn't scream. I didn't confront Martin when he came home late, casually humming to himself as he placed his award on the mantel without a word about the night. He looked at me sitting on the couch, gave a half smile, and said, "Long night. You wouldn't have enjoyed it." I nodded. I figured. He didn't notice the shift in my tone. Or if he did, he didn't care. I wish I could say I packed a suitcase and walked out dramatically, but that's not how it happened. When you've built a life around someone, a home, routines, shared calendars, family ties, you don't just walk away. You slowly start disappearing, piece by piece, from the life you once helped create. At first, I simply stopped asking. I stopped asking about his work events. I stopped asking if he needed help with anything. I stopped checking in. I still cooked, cleaned, managed bills, and remembered birthdays. But emotionally, I began to recede. Martin barely noticed. If he did, he mistook it for aging. He probably thought I was settling into some quiet, retired version of myself. But I was grieving. Grieving the marriage I thought we had. Grieving the woman I used to be when I felt loved, needed, and visible. I started sleeping in the guest room, claiming back pain from the old mattress. He didn't protest. He liked to spread out anyway, he said. The truth was, I couldn't bear to lie next to someone who once adored me and now barely looked in my direction. There was no intimacy left, not even the kind built on familiarity. Julia noticed something was wrong. During a Sunday brunch, she leaned in and whispered, "Mom, are you okay?" I looked at her, smiled tightly, and said, "I'm just tired." That was the truth, but not the kind she understood. I was tired of fighting for space. Tired of performing usefulness just to feel seen. Tired of hoping he'd notice I was slowly disappearing. One evening, after cleaning up the kitchen alone, again, I sat down with a photo album. It was one of the older ones, with yellowing pages and bent corners. I flipped through photos of us hiking in the Smokies, dancing in our bare feet at home, sitting with the kids on Halloween in silly costumes. In every photo, Martin's hand rested on my shoulder or back. His smile was wide, mine even wider. I stared at one picture of us in Paris 20 years ago. He was kissing me on the cheek while I laughed, holding a baguette like a trophy. I whispered to the woman in the photo, "What happened to you?" But I already knew. She didn't leave. She faded. The next day, I opened a fresh notebook and began to write. Nothing dramatic, just little things. Memories, frustrations, quotes I liked, names of people who made me feel valued. For the first time in years, I wrote for myself. Not grocery lists or reminders, but reflections. It wasn't a plan, not yet, but it was a beginning. Martin didn't notice the notebook. He didn't ask why I spent more time outside on the porch or why I started wearing earrings again. He didn't ask why I left for long walks and came back quieter but somehow lighter. Then one night, we were invited to a neighborhood dinner. Nothing fancy, just a small gathering with couples we'd known for years. I told Martin I didn't want to go. He looked surprised. "You always go to these." "Not anymore," I said. He furrowed his brow. "Why?" "I don't want to sit across from people who ask me what you do while they pretend not to remember I was once someone too." He didn't respond, just blinked and said, "Suit yourself." So I stayed home. I lit a candle, poured myself a glass of wine, and played the old jazz records we used to love. I sat alone at the table, not in sadness, but in stillness. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. Everyone assumed I was done, that I'd faded into the background, permanently passive. But something inside me, something I thought was gone, had stirred. I wasn't done. I wasn't broken. I wasn't angry. I was waiting. And in that waiting, something powerful was waking up. Rock bottom didn't come in one grand collapse. It arrived quietly, like fog settling in. Slow, disorienting, and nearly invisible until it was everywhere. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't screaming or broken plates or suitcases on the porch. It was a moment of complete stillness when I realized I had lost myself. And he hadn't even noticed. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October. The air was crisp and leaves crunched underfoot as I walked through our neighborhood trying to feel something. I had taken up long walks, not for health but for escape. I needed the movement. I needed to be away from that house, from the walls that once held laughter but now echoed with silence. That day, I walked farther than usual. I didn't check the time. I didn't even bring my phone. I ended up at a small park near the edge of town. There was a bench near a pond, old, paint-peeling, forgotten. I sat down, watching a few ducks glide over the surface, and for some reason, I started to cry. Not a sob, not even a whimper, just tears sliding down my cheeks with no fanfare. I didn't know what triggered it. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the peace. The realization that this park, this moment, was the most seen I had felt in years. No one there expected anything from me. No one looked at me like I was fading. No one dismissed me with a glance or erased me with a polite smile. I was just there. And somehow, that felt more comforting than anything in my own home. The worst part wasn't feeling lonely. It was realizing that I felt lonelier sitting across from my husband every day than I did on that park bench with strangers walking by. That was the moment I knew I had hit bottom. Not because I was broken, but because I no longer recognized the life I had spent decades building. When I finally returned home, the house felt colder. Not physically, but emotionally. It was Martin's day off. He was in his office as usual on a video call. I stood at the doorway for a moment, watching him. He didn't see me. He didn't pause. He didn't even hear me come in. I stood there like a ghost, and he never noticed. Later that evening, I made dinner. Chicken marsala, his favorite. I don't know why. Maybe part of me hoped he'd remember something, that he'd take one bite and look up and say, "You used to make this when we were first married." But he didn't. He ate it absently, scrolling on his phone between bites. When I asked how it was, he said, "Fine," and went back to whatever article he was reading. That was the night I stopped setting 2 places at the table. After dinner, I sat in the living room and opened a book I couldn't focus on. Martin turned on the news. The volume was too loud. I asked him to turn it down. He did, barely. Then he muttered, "You've been so sensitive lately." I looked at him, really looked at him. "I'm not sensitive," I said. "I'm drowning." He blinked at me. "What?" "Nothing," I replied. And I meant it, because explaining yourself to someone who's already decided not to hear you is like screaming into a canyon and expecting it to answer. Later that night, I went into the bathroom and stared at my reflection again. Not to fix my hair or apply cream or tidy my face, just to see myself. My eyes were tired, my skin looked dull. There were fine lines around my mouth I hadn't noticed before. I didn't feel old, I felt erased. I ran my fingers through my hair and whispered, "Is this it?" I turned off the light, sat on the edge of the tub in the dark, and just breathed. For nearly an hour, no thoughts, no plans, just me and the quiet hum of a house I no longer felt at home in. Rock bottom wasn't a crisis, it was acceptance. The moment I realized that waiting for him to see me, to love me, to choose me again, was slowly killing me. That night, I didn't make a decision. I didn't vow revenge or promise transformation. I just admitted the truth. I was gone, and no one had even noticed. But deep in that stillness, buried beneath the sadness, the resignation, the grief, something tiny flickered. A spark I hadn't felt in years. It was faint, fragile, but it was mine. And that meant I wasn't done yet. Sometimes the smallest things become the most important, not because they're loud or dramatic, but because they shine a quiet light on everything you've been trying not to see. It happened while I was reorganizing the guest room closet. I'd been trying to stay busy, filling my days with small, manageable tasks that made the silence feel less suffocating. The closet had become a mess over the years, full of old boxes, travel bags, and dusty paperwork. I had no real reason to clean it, but that's what rock bottom does. It makes you desperate for control over anything, even the placement of old winter coats. I found the envelope in a file box labeled Martin Work. It was stuffed between a stack of tax forms and a folder of outdated brochures. A simple white envelope, unsealed, addressed in familiar handwriting. Martin and Corinne. I paused. My name hadn't been beside his in years, not really. I slid the paper out, carefully unfolding it. It was a letter, handwritten, dated nearly 6 years earlier, from Greta Monroe. I recognized her signature immediately. She was his boss, the same one who'd asked about me at the banquet, the one he brushed off with, "You know how women get." I read it slowly. "Martin, I just wanted to send my gratitude again for your outstanding presentation last Friday. Several clients specifically mentioned how impactful and concise your message was, a testament to strong communication and thoughtful editing. I know Corinne had a hand in shaping the final version, and it showed. Please thank her for me. She's an asset, not just to you, but to our whole team. I hope to see her at the next event." Warmly, Greta. I read the letter again, and then again. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from the overwhelming wave of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Validation. I had helped him write that speech. I remembered the night clearly. He was stuck. The points weren't flowing, and his conclusion fell flat. I spent 4 hours sitting with him at the dining room table, editing line by line, reshaping the narrative. He delivered it that week, barely mentioned me in passing when he returned, saying only, "It went fine." But Greta had noticed. She knew. She saw me. It was the first time in years I saw written proof that I still had value, not as a wife or a hostess or a fading background character, but as a partner, a contributor, a woman with skill and voice. And Martin had buried it in a closet. I sat on the floor, holding the letter against my chest. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even surprised. I was just devastated by how carelessly he had discarded something that meant so much. He could have shown it to me. He could have said, "Thank you. She noticed. You matter." But he didn't. He filed it away like it meant nothing, because to him, maybe it did. Or maybe acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging how much I helped him, and how much he'd come to depend on the very woman he was now trying to erase. I placed the letter on the bed and stared at it for a long time. I thought of all the ways he'd made me feel small, all the times he'd stepped into the spotlight without me, taking credit for things I helped shape. Not just work presentations, our family, our home, our life. I had edited more than speeches. I had edited him, softened his edges, covered his missteps, helped him shine, and now, here it was in ink, proof. Not that I needed it, but God, did it feel good to have it. That night, I didn't tell him I found it. I didn't bring it up or leave it somewhere for him to find. I tucked it back into the envelope and slid it into my own desk drawer, not as ammunition, but as evidence. Not for him, for me. It became a turning point, not because it changed the way he treated me, but because it changed how I saw myself. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being sensitive. I wasn't imagining the erasure. I had been invisible in his story, but not in the truth. And with that realization, the part of me that had flickered weakly in the dark, the part I thought was gone, started to burn just a little brighter. I wasn't just remembering who I had been. I was beginning to see who I still was. It didn't happen overnight. There was no sudden lightning bolt, no grand speech in the mirror, but something inside me was stirring, slow and steady, like the first hint of dawn after a long night. That letter from Greta had done more than remind me of my past value. It pulled something dormant to the surface, a version of me that had gone quiet, but never truly left. I started with small things. I began making my coffee the way I liked it again, strong, black, with a hint of cinnamon. For years, I'd made it how Martin preferred, 2 sugars, splash of milk. But one morning, without thinking, I poured my cup the way I used to and took it to the porch. I sat there wrapped in a shawl, sipping slowly, savoring the bitter warmth. It felt like a ritual, a reclaiming. That same week, I dug out a box of old journals from the attic. Dozens of them. Spiral-bound notebooks, leather-bound diaries, even loose pages tucked inside folders. I used to write all the time. Thoughts, stories, fragments of poems. Somewhere along the way, between raising kids and holding a marriage together, I stopped. I told myself I didn't have time, or that what I had to say didn't matter anymore. But it did matter, and I needed to remember why. I chose one of the old journals, a blue one with worn edges and a cracked spine, and began reading. My younger self had been sharp, thoughtful, bold. I had opinions, humor, anger, passion. I underlined passages and made lists of dreams. I'd forgotten her, but there she was, waiting for me in ink. That night, I opened a fresh notebook and wrote 3 simple lines. I have given too much without asking for enough. I am not broken. I am still here. It wasn't profound, but it was honest, and it was a beginning. I started dressing for myself again, not for Martin, not for appearances, for me. I bought a soft burgundy scarf on a whim, the kind I used to wear when I taught, and looped it around my neck just to walk to the post office. I bought a new lipstick, a rich plum shade. When I saw my reflection in a store window, I didn't cringe or look away. I paused. I looked. I saw myself. My old friend Ramona called me that weekend. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Life, time, distractions, they all get in the way. But that day, I picked up. We talked for 2 hours, laughing about things that used to matter and mourning things that still did. I told her a little about what had been going on. Not everything, but enough. She didn't say much, just listened. And when I said, I think I forgot who I was, she said, no. You just stopped hearing yourself. That stuck with me. I began taking small, silent steps. I reorganized my bookshelf and pulled out the classics I loved. Jane Eyre, beloved, The Awakening. Each title felt like a mirror. I signed up for a free local writing workshop at the library. Just 6 women and a volunteer instructor who read too fast but smiled with her whole face. I didn't tell Martin. I didn't think he'd ask where I was going anyway. Every small choice, the coffee, the scarf, the pen in my hand, felt like a declaration. I wasn't staging a rebellion. I wasn't even making a plan. I was simply awakening, slowly but completely. I stopped waiting for his approval. I stopped scanning his face for recognition or praise. I started watching my own face instead, noticing when it lit up, when it calmed, when it looked alive again. Martin noticed the surface level changes. You've been getting out more, he said one morning while grabbing his keys. I have, I replied, without explanation. He looked at me for a second longer than usual, not with curiosity, but with confusion, like he wasn't sure what to make of it. I didn't offer him answers. Because this wasn't about him anymore. This was mine. My awakening wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't for anyone else to see or understand. It was quiet, steady, personal. It was the slow turning of soil before a garden begins, the kind of change that can't be undone. I was no longer asking who I was remembering, and that memory, that slow, sure truth of myself, was more powerful than anything he had ever tried to erase. After my awakening, I didn't announce anything. There were no ultimatums, no drawn-out confrontations. I didn't slam doors or throw accusations. That would have made it too easy for Martin to dismiss me as irrational or emotional. No, this part was quiet, methodical. I didn't need to be loud. I just needed to be intentional. It started with my routine. I adjusted it, piece by piece, until it no longer revolved around him. I woke earlier. I stopped waiting for Martin to come home before making dinner. I cooked what I liked, not what he preferred. If he asked why I wasn't eating with him, I'd say, "Oh, I already ate." No explanation, no emotion, just fact. I began organizing my paperwork. Bank statements, old tax records, insurance policies, everything we'd accumulated over the years. I realized, with a sharp twist in my stomach, how little I'd been involved in our finances since retiring from teaching. Martin handled most of it. By design or by habit, I wasn't sure. But it made me feel vulnerable, like I'd given away too much trust without question. So, I learned. Quietly. I opened a new checking account in my name. I rerouted the small pension deposits I still received. I transferred ownership of my parents' lake cabin, which had remained in my name since they passed, into a living trust with me as sole beneficiary. That cabin was mine, and I was going to protect it. Every step I took was rooted in reclaiming control. It wasn't about revenge. It was about agency. I had lived too long reacting to Martin's behavior. Now I was preparing for whatever came next, whether that was separation, independence, or simply peace of mind. I also started working again, not full-time and not in a school, but in a way that fed my spirit. I offered editing services for college essays and small business websites. Ramona helped me build a simple online profile. Word spread fast. I had 3 clients within 2 weeks. The payments weren't large, but they reminded me I still had value beyond the walls of our home. Martin barely noticed. He saw me leave the house more, sure. He noticed I wore my nicer clothes more often. One morning he said, "You've been putting more effort into your look lately." I looked at him and replied, "I'm putting effort into myself." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Maybe he didn't want to ask a question he wasn't ready to hear the answer to. I stopped volunteering information. If he asked how my day was, I gave polite, surface-level answers. If he didn't ask, I didn't offer anything. The silence between us used to feel oppressive. Now I let it be. It gave me space to breathe. Around this time, I removed the framed wedding photo from the mantel and replaced it with a picture of Julia and Emmett as children, standing barefoot in the grass at my parents' old cabin. When Martin noticed the change, he paused. "Where's the wedding photo?" "In the closet," I said. He didn't ask why. He didn't put it back. It was a small gesture, but symbolic. Our wedding, once the centerpiece of our shared history, was no longer something I wanted displayed, not in the place where guests would see it, not where I had to look at it every day. The more I reclaimed my space, the clearer my mind became. I was no longer consumed with how to fix us. I had stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "What do I need to feel whole again?" It was in this silence, this slow rebuild, that I started to recognize my own strength. For years, I'd thought strength had to be loud, shouting to be heard, fighting to be seen. But now I understood a different kind of power, the kind that moves in stillness, the kind that doesn't beg or demand but simply acts, quietly, confidently. Every account opened, every document organized, every choice made without him. It was all part of a setup, not for some dramatic revenge, but for freedom, for clarity, for the moment when I could stand on my own and say, "I'm ready." And the truth was, I wasn't preparing to leave Martin. I was preparing to return to myself. No announcement, no ceremony, just quiet steps toward the woman I had almost forgotten I could be. Power doesn't always shift with noise. Sometimes it changes hands in silence, in the spaces where people aren't paying attention. That's how it happened in our home. While Martin continued moving through his days, emails, meetings, calls, I was moving too. Quietly, deliberately. And without him noticing, the balance between us began to tilt. It started with my presence. Not the way I used to show up for him, but how I began to show up for myself. I moved through the house differently. My posture changed. I made decisions without asking. I wore colors I hadn't touched in years. Bold, saturated tones that drew the eye. I stopped asking if plans worked for his schedule and started making my own. Martin noticed. At first, he didn't know what to make of it. He'd ask where I was going, and I'd say, out. Not coldly, just plainly. I didn't owe him details anymore. He'd blink, a little surprised, but wouldn't follow up. Maybe he didn't care, or maybe he was starting to wonder what had shifted. That wondering? That was new. Julia visited more often. She called weekly now and not out of obligation. She said I sounded lighter. That word struck me. Lighter. As if I'd been carrying something for so long that my voice had forgotten how to float. But she was right. I was lighter. Not because my problems had disappeared, but because I was no longer pretending to be someone else, just to make Martin comfortable. One afternoon, she brought her son over, my grandson Caleb. We baked cookies together, just the two of us, while Martin stayed in his office. When Julia saw us laughing in the kitchen, she smiled and said, "You look alive, Mom." I didn't realize until then how long it had been since someone described me that way. Even Emmett called more. Our conversations were short, sometimes awkward. He's more reserved than Julia. But he started asking questions that made me pause. "Are you happy, Mom?" he asked once. I told him, "I'm working on it," and I meant it. Outside the family, small things began to shift as well. At the writing workshop, the instructor asked me to read one of my pieces aloud. I did. A short essay about forgotten dreams and middle-aged clarity. When I finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then they applauded. Real applause. Not polite, earned. Later, one of the women, Anne, approached me and said, "You should submit that somewhere." I smiled and said, "Maybe I will." And for the first time in decades, I meant it. Even my appearance became a quiet act of power. One evening, I came downstairs wearing a long navy coat I hadn't worn since my teaching days. It fit perfectly again. Martin glanced up from his phone and said, "You look different." "I feel different," I replied, and I left it at that. He started noticing things. The absence of familiar routines, the way I no longer reminded him about his dry cleaning, the fact that I didn't laugh at his half-hearted jokes during dinner. One morning, he asked if I could help him with a presentation. I smiled, soft but firm, and said, "I don't do that anymore." He looked at me confused. "But you always help me with those." "Exactly," I said. "I always did." And I didn't need to say more. The implication hung in the air like a quiet thunderclap. That was when the power shift became real, when he started feeling the absence of the version of me he had taken for granted, not because I was punishing him, but because I was done pouring energy into someone who only drank from the cup and never refilled it. At dinner one night, he asked, "Is something going on?" I looked at him calmly. "Yes, with me." He waited, clearly expecting an explanation. I gave none, because I had nothing to prove. It was no longer the center of my world. And I think, for the first time, he realized that. The power wasn't in the confrontation. It was in my clarity, in the ease with which I occupied my own space, made my own decisions, and took up room again. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for his permission to grow. I just grew. And that shift, quiet, steady, undeniable, made him nervous. Not because I was leaving, but because he finally realized I didn't need to stay. The confrontation didn't come with yelling. No plates were broken, no names were called. There were no stormy ultimatums or door-slamming dramatics. It was quieter than that, which in some ways made it more powerful, because this wasn't a scene for anyone else. This was for me. It began with an invitation. A formal one. A cream-colored envelope slid under the door one Thursday morning by a courier in a navy vest. Martin was already at work. The return address was embossed with the logo of his company. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note on elegant stationery. Dear Mrs. Ramsey, we would be honored if you joined us at this year's Executive Appreciation Dinner. Your past support and contributions have not gone unnoticed. We hope to finally thank you properly in person. Warmest regards, Greta Monroe, Chief Regional Officer. I stared at the words, my fingers tightening around the edges. For a moment I felt dizzy, not with shock, but with recognition. After years of erasure, someone had remembered me, publicly, purposefully. Greta Monroe, the same woman Martin once dismissed with a wave of his hand, the same woman who saw me for what I was, not an accessory but an architect of his success. I RSVP'd yes the same day. I didn't tell Martin. The dinner was a week later, held at a glass-walled venue overlooking the river. It was black tie. I wore a long, fitted black dress with a satin neckline and simple silver earrings. Ramona came over to help me with my hair. Soft waves pinned back just enough to frame my face. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see someone trying too hard. I saw a woman stepping back into herself. Martin hadn't even mentioned the dinner. Either he assumed I wasn't invited or didn't care enough to ask. That evening, when he returned from work, I was already dressed. He froze in the doorway of our bedroom. Are you going somewhere? I smiled. Yes, the executive dinner. His brow furrowed. You got an invite? I did, from Greta. I turned and clipped on my bracelet. She said she wanted to thank me personally. He stood there for a moment too long. I could see him searching for words, maybe even excuses, but I didn't give him time to find either. I'll see you there, I said, and walked out the door. The venue buzzed with the hum of clinking glasses and soft piano music. I arrived alone, but didn't feel alone. People I hadn't seen in years greeted me, warmly, genuinely. Greta found me near the welcome table, and the moment she saw me, her face lit up. Corinne, she said, stepping forward and wrapping me in a hug. You look stunning. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you, I said. I'm glad I am too. She guided me to a table near the front, not the back where the spouses were usually seated. This was a table reserved for key figures, and my name was on a card beside hers. When Martin arrived 20 minutes later, he spotted me before I saw him. I felt his gaze settle on me, then on the place card, then on Greta, laughing warmly beside me. He approached slowly, uncertain, like he'd stumbled into a room where the rules had changed. Corinne, he said, half smiling, I didn't know you'd be here. I was invited, I replied, turning toward him calmly. Personally. Greta placed a hand on Martin's shoulder. You never told me how sharp your wife is, Martin. I still remember that presentation you gave 6 years ago, the one she edited. You should have brought her to more of these. You missed out. He stammered something, a joke probably, but the damage was done. The comment landed like a spotlight on the truth. He hadn't left me behind. He had pushed me out, and now everyone knew it. I didn't gloat, I didn't smirk. I just looked at him with the kind of calm that only comes when you no longer need someone's approval to exist. We sat through dinner. I engaged in lively conversations. I laughed, shared insights, even exchanged cards with a woman running a nonprofit who said, "We need people like you." When it ended, Martin tried to walk me to the car. I declined. I drove myself, I said. That was the confrontation. No shouting, no accusations, just clarity. Just presence. For the first time in years, I stood fully in my own power, not as his wife, not as a forgotten woman, but as myself. And he saw it. All of it. Too late. After the dinner, something in Martin shifted, or maybe it was just his illusion of control that cracked. He saw the writing on the wall, though he didn't know how to read it. I could feel it in the way he hovered more in the kitchen, in the way he asked questions he never used to ask. Where are you going? Who was that on the phone? Do you need help with anything? But the thing about regret is that it doesn't erase what's already been written. And the version of me he was trying to find again no longer existed. The final justice didn't come with courtroom drama or bitter revenge. It came through something far more poetic. Truth delivered plainly, in front of the one person he least expected it from. It was 2 weeks after the executive dinner. Martin's boss, Greta, called me personally. "Corinne," she said, "I know this may be out of the blue, but would you be willing to speak at our Women in Leadership luncheon next month? The theme is unseen influence and, well, your story fits that better than anyone else's I can think of." I sat in silence for a beat, absorbing the irony of the moment. I had once been the woman who sat quietly at the back of Martin's events, forgotten or ignored. And now I was being asked to speak, not as a guest, but as the headliner. "Yes," I said simply. "I'd be honored." I didn't tell Martin. I let the day come as a surprise. The luncheon was held at a high-end venue downtown filled with professionals, executives, and community leaders. Greta introduced me with genuine warmth, talking about my experience as an educator, my contributions behind the scenes, and the quiet strength that too often goes unnoticed in women like me. I walked to the podium with my heart steady and clear. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't there to perform or impress. I was there to tell the truth. "My name is Corinne Ramsey," I began, and for many years I believed that support meant invisibility, that loving someone meant stepping back so they could shine. And for a while I was proud of that. I saw Martin seated toward the back, eyes locked on me. I continued. But then I realized something. Support doesn't mean silence. Partnership isn't about fading behind someone. It's about growing side by side and being recognized for it. I had spent years helping someone else build a career, polish their words, navigate their success, all while slowly disappearing from my own life. There were nods around the room. A few women looked at each other knowingly. I was never bitter about it, I said, but I was tired. Tired of being edited out of a story I helped write. I paused, then looked directly at the audience, and at Martin. It wasn't until someone from his world saw me, valued me, and said it out loud that I started to remember who I was. That's the power of being seen. And that's what I want every woman in this room to know. You don't have to disappear to be loyal. You don't have to shrink to love someone. And you don't need permission to matter. The applause was real, not thunderous or forced, but deep, sustained, and full of something heavier than admiration. It was recognition, solidarity. Afterwards, several women approached me, thanking me for speaking. Some shared their own stories, quietly, tearfully, and then Martin walked over. He looked unsure of himself, a rare sight. He held my gaze, then said, "You never told me you were speaking today." "No," I said, "I didn't." He opened his mouth to speak again, but I stepped past him. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need his reaction. The justice had already been served, not by him, not by confrontation, but by truth being seen, heard, and believed by people who mattered. Later that week, I received a letter from Greta. "Corinne, your words moved the room. Thank you for reminding all of us that strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's just honest. We'd love to have you contribute to our mentorship program this year. Let's talk soon. Warmly, Greta." That letter, like the first one, went in my desk drawer. But this time, it didn't stay hidden. I framed it. Because final justice didn't come in the form of punishment. It came as a reward, earned, deserved, and undeniably mine. The speech at the luncheon seemed to trigger a ripple I hadn't expected. Not just in Martin, but in others around me. People who'd been silent or distant suddenly reached out as if seeing me clearly for the first time. But it wasn't their attention I was seeking anymore. It was their honesty. And for once, they came to me with exactly that. Julia called me that weekend. Not with idle questions or routine check-ins, but with something heavier in her voice. "Mom," she said, "can we talk? In person?" When she arrived the next afternoon, she was carrying an old photo album. It was one I hadn't seen in years, one she must have taken from the basement. We sat on the back porch, the fall air crisp around us as she placed it between us and opened to a page filled with birthday parties, holiday dinners, and lazy Sundays on the couch. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low. About everything you've done for us, for Dad, for all of us. I stayed quiet, letting her speak. I think I didn't want to see it. I assumed you were okay because you always seemed okay. And now I realize you weren't. You were just quiet. I nodded. That's what mothers do sometimes. We make quiet look normal. She reached over and held my hand, tears gathering in her eyes. I'm sorry, Mom, for not asking, for not noticing. I gave her a small smile. You were busy growing up. I was busy fading out. She shook her head. I want to know you now. The real you, not just the woman who made everything run smoothly. That moment, her reaching back across the gap with humility and love, meant more than applause or public recognition. It was healing. Not because I needed her to fix what had happened, but because she was finally seeing me asterisk as me asterisk. Not just as a role I played. Even Emmett sent a text later that night. Just 2 words. Asterisk proud, Mom. That was enough. As for Martin, he made his own attempt a few days later. It was tentative, clumsy, but clearly an effort. I've been thinking, he began, standing awkwardly in the kitchen while I arranged flowers for my garden. About everything. How I've treated you. How I've acted. I didn't say anything. Just let the silence do the heavy lifting. I was wrong, he said. I didn't see what you were going through. And I took you for granted. I looked up at him. Yes, you did. He hesitated. Is it too late? I met his eyes. Too late for what? For an apology? No. For a second chance at who we asterisk used asterisk to be? Maybe. He looked down. I just want to be part of your life again. I gave a gentle shrug. Then you'll have to be a different part of it, because I'm not going backward. And that was the difference. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was asterisk clear asterisk. I didn't need his remorse to validate me. I didn't need a grand reconciliation. I had reconnected. Not just with the people I loved, but with myself. Some endings aren't loud. They don't come with music swelling or dramatic lines. They're quiet, like the turning of a page, and just as permanent. A few weeks after the luncheon, I returned to the park bench where I'd once sat in tears, wondering if anyone would ever see me again. This time I brought a journal and a thermos of cinnamon coffee. I watched the ducks on the pond, the same ones I'd once cried in front of, and smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had survived something that used to make me feel invisible. I flipped open the journal and reread what I'd written months ago. I have given too much without asking for enough. I am not broken. I am still here. That last line hit me hardest. I am still here. Not the same woman who once stood frozen in front of a hallway mirror, hearing her husband say she wasn't pretty enough. Not the woman who sat through dinner parties smiling through erasure. Not the one who waited for someone else to hand her value. No. I was someone new now. Someone asterisk built asterisk from those very fractures. I'd found purpose again. Through my writing, through my speaking, through mentoring younger women who reminded me so much of myself. I had built something outside of marriage, outside of motherhood, that was mine and mine alone. The framed letter from Greta hung near my desk now, not as a trophy, but as a marker, a line in the sand between who I was and who I had become. Martin was still there, in the house. We coexisted, not coldly but distantly. He had started to change in small ways, listening more, asking instead of assuming, remembering to say thank you. But it wasn't about him anymore. I didn't need him to become someone better for me to feel whole. That had never been the solution. My story didn't end with divorce or revenge. It ended with asterisk reclamation asterisk. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that builds over time until one day you wake up and realize you didn't just survive. You came asterisk back asterisk to life. And if there's one lesson I carry with me, it's this. Sometimes the people closest to you stop seeing you. Not because you've changed, but because they've stopped asterisk looking asterisk, But that doesn't mean you've disappeared. It just means it's time to open your own eyes, turn on your own light, and see yourself again. That reflection, that quiet rediscovery, it was more than enough. It was everything.